Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, The Practice of Collecting, the Life of Collections Past and Present. We're just letting in participants from the waiting room, so we will be getting started shortly, and we appreciate your patience. Thanks. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program here for January 11th, 2021. It's a new year and some new programs from the book club. We're just letting participants in from the waiting room now, so we will be getting started shortly. Thanks for your patience. We'll be right back. Good evening, everyone. It's a few minutes past 5 o'clock now, and I think individuals will join us as we're in progress. So we're just going to get started here. Good evening, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program, The Practice of Collecting, the Life of Collections Past and Present, presented by Spencer W. Stuart. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host this webinar this evening. Tonight, we have more than 135 people joining us for this presentation. So for those of you who are new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor supported organization dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, and more. If you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply cannot do what we do without the support of our members. I encourage you to visit our website at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the Book Club of California. And now for tonight's speaker and our program, The Practice of Collecting, the Life of Collections Past and Present, presented by Spencer W. Stuart. Our speaker, Spencer W. Stuart, provides advisory services to private collectors as well as institutions aiding in the design and execution of collection development, inventories, catalogs and collection appraisals, and the deaccession of strategies. He holds a master's degree in the history of art from the Courtauld Institute in London, England, where he was the recipient of the Director's Award. At Bonham's Auctioneers, after graduating, he worked closely with the North American Rare Books and Manuscripts Department in Toronto and New York. In concert with his advising, Spencer is an active writer and lecturer on histories of the printed word for a variety of publications, including The Book Collector and Amphora, as well as the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. He is the vice chair of the Alcuin Society, a Canadian organization that promotes the appreciation of beautifully produced books. Tonight, Spencer will discuss case studies from his professional practice, as well as the past, to chart the life cycle of collections and the collectors who build them. Through these examinations, he's going to touch on important things that collectors should consider at key moments of their collecting, such as motivations that move one to collect, how to maintain perspective while actively collecting, and finally, the legacy of a collection. He will comment on the structural changes that have taken place in the rare book and the printed material markets, resulting in a more transparent ecosystem to participate in as a collector. He'll also share some observations of new collectors that he feels are redefining the notions of who collects and what influences their focus. Collecting is a journey, as many of you may know, and executed with foresight, it can be a source of both self-exploration and understanding of the world. Tonight, I hope that Spencer will inspire new collectors and even reinvigorate those with an established focus. So if you have questions for our speaker tonight, please use the chat and the Q&A function in Zoom. We should have time at the top of the hour to take questions, and we will curate those questions from the Q&A and from the chat. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Spencer Stuart, and pass over the controls for tonight's webinar. Spencer, it's all yours.
Great, Kevin. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining me this evening. It's really a pleasure to be speaking to the club. You know, as Kevin was talking about, my work particularly focuses on private collectors, or that will be the angle that we'll be talking about this evening. Early stage collecting, the middle of people's career as collectors, and late stage. One thing that I like to talk about right off the beginning is this idea of collecting and the impulse of it. So we're talking today, you know, members of the club, and the club itself are collections that are mostly formed in adulthood. But you know, if you think about it, if you think back to kind of the beginning of one's experiences, we're in some ways we're always kind of collecting in one way or another, and it's impulsive at the beginning. It starts, you know, maybe around the age of 3, through stones, shells, things of that nature, objects out there that you start to kind of gather together that have, you know, affinities or things that kind of connect them together, be it color, size, shape. You start to make orders of them, and that starts to change as you continue through to the age of, say, 7, 8, 9, when you start to look at cards, perhaps even books by that point, marbles, things of that nature. And as it continues onward, you know, maybe there's a bit of a space, and then you start to collect in adulthood. Maybe it's a continuation from an early age onward. But there's a movement into it being something of a more conscious pursuit, and something that's a bit more of a kind of intellectual conversation as well with those items. They're items that start to have connections with other objects and histories that are beyond yourself, yet they also shape you as well. There's a kind of threshold that takes place there between your personal histories and the items and ideas that you see out in the world itself. And so that's often kind of a foundational thing that I like to talk about in talking about collecting, is that we have these adult collections, these collections that you form, you know, very much within a market, within the dynamics of a collecting market, with other collectors, dealers, auctions, things of that nature. But that there's also an element of the impulse within it as well. And in some ways, that's kind of why people continue to collect as they go on with their lives. It's that fluttering in between of the impulsive part of it, the passion of it, and also the intellectual pursuit of it. And that's why I kind of like to think about collections as being on a spectrum. And so, you know, if we think about you know, object-based collecting, I would consider that to be more of a kind of traditional practice, and that would be something that you would do through bibliographies, and very much a completist form of creating a collection. One in which there are some predetermined outcomes in order for a statement to be made about your collection. So for instance, here I'm using the example of some major writers from the history of Irish literature, but you can think of something, say, Kelmscott publications or something of that nature, where there's definitely a definite predetermined amount of items that create around that circle around the interests that you have. And in many ways, what happens there is that you're collecting a very specific object, you know, a book, or say a specific photographer, things of that nature. And then there's the more kind of more uh, amorphous type of practice that's maybe, as Lisa Unger Baskin talks about in her collection around women's work, which has been often cited as, you know, a really a pioneering collection formed in the later part of the 20th century, um, of a question, an absence in histories, that looking around, that there's something that's not reflected, and yet you're certain it does take place in the culture. And so, you know, in talking about collecting and the approach that people have, it's a spectrum. And what happens with idea-based collecting, or maybe even kind of question-based collecting, based on an absence or something that you're an idea that you're trying to see manifestations of in the culture, um, it starts to become almost a multimedia exploration as well, as you can see in this display case from the Grolier exhibition that took place around that collection. Um, you know, in both cases, if it's a more object-based completist collection or idea-based exploration, uh, you're creating a world, and it's a world that is a threshold in a larger cultural conversation and one's interior conversation and personal identity as to how one relates to that history. And in that way also, you're engaging in the culture of collecting, if you step back further. Now, that's an interesting conversation to have, and I look forward to the questions and comments at the end of this talk, because there are very much some archetypes to the practice of collecting that I think continue to this day, but don't necessarily have to remain. One of them being that the idea of the passion of collecting and the thrill of the hunt, the impulsive reaching out for a particular object because of a belief that it may be scarce and the offer may never present itself again. And and that's possible. You know, researching the availability of an item may reveal it to be, in fact, quite rare. But there's also a particular, there's a situation here that's really interesting of the current conditions within which one collects. So, you know, we're at a point in which there is a really a boon of information and good, well-sourced information to make some informed decisions as to your collecting, and to start planning out your collecting in a way that allows you to be somewhat analytical while still maintaining the passion of collecting. And so in that case, it's important to keep in mind that there are there is information and available information to seek out, um, you know, where to source particular objects and items for your collections. So you know, once one identifies as a collector, I think it is important to sort of get a sense of really thinking about it as a journey and as something that is sustainable. One of the things that I noticed that started out my practice in being a collections advisor was working through the auction house, going to collections. Often cases, the collector was deceased and I was dealing with the family, and seeing that some collections were going along, but that there was at some point an enthusiasm had dropped off, or maybe a feeling that there had been too much invested in it and some of the strategy had fallen away, or too much money had been spent in the wrong direction of one's actual focus or interests in collecting. So I think it is really important, once one sort of hones out an interest, something that really draws them in as a collector, to start thinking about allocating time to nourish that collection, space to protect and store that collection, and also capital or resources to maintain one's collecting, so that at that point when you are offered an item that perhaps is really a keystone piece to one's collecting practice, to one's story, that you can take those risks, and not feel that you're out of control of the story that you're trying to tell through your collecting. So another thing I think is kind of important from the outset to talk about with collecting is the cataloging of one's collection. So, I show a ledger here, Excel, and software. A ledger is really good when it's tens of items. Excel is really great when it's hundreds, and softwares tend to be around the thousands mark of collecting, and mixed collections too, a variety of them. I think one of the things that's really useful about this, and taking this approach as soon as one starts to feel that they are developing their collecting practice, what's important about this is that a lot of the information and resources are online. And if you have your collection inventoried well through your computer, it allows you to sort of connect that and starts to develop that independence that you can start to create as a collector, in which you are sourcing items, staying in contact with dealers that may have offers, and also finding stuff on your own, finding things through other means. So I think that that's something that's really is an important thing to start from the outset. And oftentimes it's not fun work, it's the rainy day work, but it really does help for starting to get a sense of what are some of the stories that you're trying to tell through the collecting that you're doing. And then another thing, what it also does is it really helps to ground one's collecting in the actual contents of one's collection. Oftentimes there's an impression that one has of collecting, and then there's the actual contents of the collection. And that can, through being able to externalize it, being able to put it on paper in a way, you can really get a sense of, what are you dealing with, and what are some of the directions that you're going in. It also starts to expose that oftentimes a collection is actually many collections. And I think that's an important thing to talk about, is to think about some may be in different states of completeness, or they may be developing into something entirely different, maybe something unexpected, that is truly the path that you want to go to explore, and the story you want to tell through your collection. So I think you're often wanting to ask yourself this question of imagining this, if your collection is to be seen as a world, as a place that people can kind of visit, to get a sense of how are all these items orbiting around one another, and how are they telling a story about your collecting. I think what's happening right now that's really interesting is a shift in the way we're thinking about collecting itself. Oftentimes we talk about collections, capital C collections, as a solid entity at the end of the process. And I think we're now at a time where we can think about the process of collecting in a kind of linear fashion, or in a way that we can reflect on the path that we've taken to collect the various items that coalesce together to tell stories about ourselves and the world around us. And I think that's important, not only when you're perhaps donating your collection, or offering it to family and friends, or when you're maybe divesting of it and selling it, that you can get a sense of what was that passage, what was that process. I think that that's something that that we're now more capable of than ever of doing, through making use of technologies and stepping back and thinking more analytically about the process of being a custodian of collections. So that's just a kind of preamble to talk about some collections that I've worked with in recent years, and just discussing them, how through cataloging them, through working with collectors in building their collections, you can start to sort of see that this process and this shift that happens, the dialogue that takes place between the collector and their collections, and the world outside, and the collecting conditions in which they're building those collections. How the market dictates it, but also where you're living, and maybe some of the interests that you have, maybe your vocation or things of that nature, and how those influence and change some of the interests and focuses that you have. So and through that, how that expresses the individual even more in their collecting. So this is an example of an individual I was working with who started out with survey texts of the history of photography, and these were ones that anyone who's interested in photo books of this nature, these are things that they're readily available. They're books that you can find in bookstores, and they provide really great layouts as to some of the major practitioners, especially throughout the 20th century. And what happened is that this was a gentleman who was a career graphic designer, and someone who had family friends who were photographers, something that kind of engaged them even when they were younger. They did photography themselves, and started to look at the survey texts and started to actually really take a focus and an interest on the very, interesting enough, graphic nature of the photography of the Bauhaus practitioners. So Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and characters of that sort. And this developed into an interest in the prints themselves, the physical prints. And this was at a time that was just before the 2000s. And so what happened here was there were available prints, and there was not yet, one of the major things that took place in photo collecting was Martin Parr's bibliography of photo books, but also Roth's collection on photo books as well, which really changed the dynamics of it, increased the prices. And what happened at this time as well for this collector, and this is when I started to work with them, was in this transition of selling the prints and starting to focus particularly on the connection of photo montage and poster art through the Bauhaus and other avant-garde practices through the 20th century. And so what was interesting is that I helped through the transition of financing that new direction. And it wasn't one that happened immediately. It was a gradual transition. But this was also at the same time that this gentleman was downsizing. And so it was a change and a shift in how he was seeing these items. He was interested in spending time with them and sitting down with them, and also seeing how it was connecting with his own practice as a graphic designer. He was at this point also shifting away from doing more computer-based stuff and thinking about the process of making graphic design. And so there was a kind of historical shift that was taking place at that same time. And so this is an interesting example of someone who'd started out through the surveys on into a very specific interest in the collecting, and then it branched out into the graphic qualities of it. Now, this is a case study, a sort of a discussion that came from when I was working in the auction houses, and this was a couple. And to begin, I think it's interesting to talk about couples and collecting. This is something that I think is a conversation that's starting to happen now more. But there is, in a way, this was a couple. It was an Irish couple who were expats who were based in Canada, and they were I was there to oversee the consignment of some Irish literature, some of the ones that we'd mentioned earlier. And when you walked upstairs where the books were stored, to the right you saw paperbacks, and to the left you saw the first editions. And what was interesting is that as we were processing them and looking through them, you realize that their collecting itself was not only it was an act for them to connect together and think about their homeland, but it was also a vehicle through which they traveled back to Ireland from the 70s onwards. And they would trade in one copy for another. So they would start with the third edition and make their way up gradually. So that it was a very small jewel-like collection. It was very neatly ordered, but it was extremely precise. And it was very much focused on the first editions. And it was something that they'd worked towards. They'd supplemented it through their income as well. And slowly but surely, they'd built it up to what it was today. And what was interesting is that the family was there as well during this process. And they'd grown up being encouraged to read the paperbacks and have a look at, when they were able to have a look at the first editions. And so there was this exchange, an intergenerational exchange about the book as the object, the debut of the book, and the content of the texts themselves. And I always thought of it as such an interesting and excellent example of that exchange taking place over the time that it does take to transfer these stories to people, of the act of collecting and the significance that it has to the collector. And what this also helped in was that at the time in which they decided to consign these items, there wasn't a feeling of a kind of rupture or a pulling away of the collection from the family itself. They had been able to spend time together with those objects, and through that had been able to make a meaningful connection with those items and the history that their parents were interested in exploring. Um, and so I've always thought of this one as a really nice example of this, because I do think it takes time. And these are although I'm talking about a kind of analytic approach through cataloging and getting a sense of one's resources through to build a collection, the time it takes to build a collection, that there is the emotional element to it. And that is an element of time that does need to be accounted for, because it is very much connected with one's identity. So I think that this is an interesting example of that. Also, I would say that it's interesting, the couple clients that I've dealt with, I noticed that there is an analytic approach because they seek counsel in one another as they're developing the collections. And there's a variety of different collections that sometimes take place that are developed individually and together. And I think that there's still the conversations yet to be had about the development of couples collecting. It's really a fascinating element. Another example here. This is a private client that I was working with, who was a dual citizen based in Toronto, an ad man who was interested in. He was in his late 60s at this point when I was working with him, and what happened here was he received a gift from an uncle of his of the Walt Whitman, the Putnam Sons compilation of Walt Whitman's writings. And anyone who's interested in Whitman knows that this is it's peppered with photographs of Whitman throughout his life. And this was a gentleman that was started out, interested in the beats. He was of that generation of Black Mountain School, and that kind of writing. And this uncle was also interested in literature and passed this on as a gift. And this started to become very much a focus for this gentleman. And he wasn't collecting the beat writing at that time, but started to get interested in Walt Whitman and interested in Blake and some of the writers that had influenced Ginsberg and others within the beat movement. And what's interesting is that, I was helping him at the point where you see on the right of developing carte de visites and various a photographic collection of Whitman and other writers. But what was interesting is that as we were talking about his collecting, the thing that he was really interested in about Whitman, it wasn't the literary production. It was very much the creation of an identity, the way in which Whitman was able to fashion himself. And so although he was, keeping an eye on the first edition of Leaves of Grass, it was actually not ever the one he was fully interested in. He was fascinated with and very much considered the second edition, the Keystone, the one that famously has the Emerson quote on the spine that was, notoriously not granted by Emerson, but shows a kind of audacity that Whitman had, and very much this collector had admired that in him. Now, again, similar to the graphic designer I'd mentioned earlier, he was also going through a shift in a downsizing in his living space, and decided also around that same time. Again, these things happen in slow transitions, and they're not always the root reason, but this was an interest in starting to focus on the photography of writers. So I helped oversee the sale of quite a bit of the high spot parts of his collection in order to start to finance carte de visites, which were relatively readily available and not difficult to source. But he started to develop an interest in particularly American writers and the way in which they used photography, the transcendentalists and others, to create images of themselves, very much part and parcel to their writing. And so this is a kind of interesting example as well of a shift that happened in his collecting over time, and something that we were able to chart through cataloging the collection. These were stories that they emerged through sitting down with the contents of the collection. Something that, sometimes it's difficult. It takes time, and sometimes having a look at items that you may have thought could, help finance other parts of the collecting. Starting to really get a sense of the reality of what the collection contains and what are some of the possibilities and opportunities that can arise from collecting. A client that I'm working with at the moment that this is someone that's has been only kind of collecting the last 10 years, but it's off of an interest very specifically in sort of astrophysics and other larger questions that are brought about through modern science, and some of the research that and some of the theories of the 20th century and onward. And this is someone who is interested in it. She is a psychologist, but is very much interested in the way that scientific ideas transform our thought about the world and ourselves. And so, very much there's kind of an explosion in this interest, and especially with the bibliography of Norman and Hooke that came out in the early 2000s, which helps to kind of form this, particularly the discussion of cyberspace. We're starting to piece this collection together, and looking over bibliographies together, looking over source documents, where to find these. Some cases, these are articles published in larger journals. So trying to find those pieces and trying to get a sense of the timeline of, how long will this take to create this collection, and what are some of the ideas that she's really interested in exploring. One of the major ones is artificial intelligence, and moving towards some of those ideas. And so this is an interesting one because it is in a very real way. It's very much like, say, collecting the history of medicine. But there's also an element to it where it requires a little bit more high-level searching within, a compilation of journals to find a particular article that really is a kernel that explodes into a massive idea that changes the way we understand the world. And so that's one that I like to discuss, just thinking about the kind of the very precise researching that is required to start to locate some of those articles. So just to finish off here, I think, I'm really looking forward to some of the conversations and questions that emerge from some of these discussions. But this is just a couple of takeaway ideas that I like to talk about with clients and people that I'm working with who are trying to sort of set out to create collections that are emblematic of their ideas. And is first of all, obviously, to, once you self-identify, to start cataloging, start getting a sense of what are some of the items, what are the directions that you're taking in your collecting. And this whole idea that, by taking an analytic approach, it doesn't take away from the passion of collecting, the thrill of the hunt. It helps to kind of open that up and actually allow you to maintain the enthusiasm as you continue through. Another thing is that, through search engines, through listservs, things of this nature, there's way more trusted information that allows for collectors, or rather, yes, collectors, to build collections on trusted information and start to expand off into new avenues. And so, yeah, I think now we can kind of open up to conversation, some of the questions, Kevin. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for your time.
Spencer, that was really interesting, especially for me personally as a collector, and I'm sure for many of the attendees on this call who are collectors. There are some great questions that I'm going to ask you in a few minutes, but I want to start by saying that maybe like some of the attendees here, I've never really thought about the way I approach my collecting, right? Object versus idea. And there's a really interesting question in here about like taste-based collecting that we're going to get to in a minute. And I've never really thought about the whole idea of that the triangle, right? With space, time, and money, the resource, I call it the resource triangle. And I think that's really something important that people should think about, especially as you start collecting. Because it can become a problem. And there's a question here about, can you tell us a story of where it had become a problem, one of those elements for someone you're working with. But most importantly, I think I never really thought about my collecting and it tells a story, right? Of who I am, what I care about, what's important to me. And it's true, it does do that. And I think maybe like other collectors, I maybe need to be better about focusing that in, honing in on what exactly is that story that I'm trying to tell. So it's clear for myself to help me in my collecting, and it helps identify what the legacy of that collection is. So those are just some of the aha moments for me in this presentation. And I want to really jump to some of these great questions that are here if you're ready for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the first one that I want to bring up is the question says that you talk about idea-based or completeness-based collections. And this question is about, what about taste-based collecting, which applies more maybe to artworks or artist books? I like this one, or I don't particularly like that one. Such collecting reflects a personality maybe more than collecting a category or an author or something like that. Do you want to talk a little bit about that as an approach or your experience with that?
Yeah, I think, that in a way, like the idea, the goalposts, if you will, or the bookends of a discussion of object-based collecting and idea-based, within that is the expression of how one collects. So, yeah, this idea of maybe trying to collect towards an overall style, a kind of an eclectic approach, perhaps. That would be maybe a way of phrasing it. Is something that takes place within that spectrum, is explored through the idea of one's collecting. I think of, say, if you're interested in, say, object-based collecting, that's a completist approach, that may have you getting in touch with sourcing items internationally. They may be a very well established form of collecting or publisher, for instance. And so what that ends up doing is it keeps you in a very developed channel of where you can source the items. There's not going to be much surprise there. But let's say someone's interested in more local form, like let's say music scenes, maybe jazz scenes within a particular neighborhood within a particular period of time. That has you kind of going in a different direction that goes towards a more local interest, and it has you sourcing within a smaller radius, and that's a totally different nature. That defines a different nature of collecting. I don't think I'm really exactly answering the question, but I would say that maybe taste-based is more along this kind of more abstract idea-based collecting. When you go to the object-based, you're engaging in a dialogue with a tradition of collecting, and you're inserting yourself within that. And in some ways, there's that the expression is a kind of relinquishing oneself to the history of a form of collecting a particular thing, say the Kelmscott, as it were. And then there's maybe a creation of identity a formation of style that is exhibited through the items that you collect.
Mhm.
And that's maybe more of an interior process that's being expressed outwardly through the items that you decide to purchase and have in your collection. I have dealt with eclectic, I would call them kind of eclectic, eccentric collections where they're very disassociated from, you come into them and you very much feel like you're in someone's mind. Um, and it's an extension, a hyper extension
Mhm.
of the way that they perceive space and time. It feels like you're walking into another world. And there's a tradition there too, but I think it's happening much more. And I think it's able to happen much more because the internet's sort of facilitating that ability to find really quirky stuff. But
Mhm.
also the internet's helping to facilitate people, in pre-COVID times and to meet in flea markets and things like that to find also really wild things that you'd never imagined. So there's much more of a chance operation through that. That's really
Yeah,
interesting.
that's actually a nice little segue into one of these other questions about collecting during quarantine.
Mm.
Like, how are things different now, recently in this last year? What are
Yeah.
the trends that you're seeing, or the challenges or the opportunities to collecting during this time?
Yeah, I think one of the major things that I'm hearing from clients is that absence of haptic, the ability to touch the items and spend time with them and
Mm.
feel them in that way. Uh, but at the same time, there's also been the dealers and people who are sourcing the materials have had time to also adapt and be able to provide as much information as possible. The auction houses are also doing the same. They're doing a lot of, they're trying to facilitate and try and adapt to that absence as best as they can. So, I think that there's more information being provided to inform purchases and make people feel that they're not taking on risk. Another thing that's happening right now is that the shift happened really fast to virtual fairs and things of that nature, which were working, quite well. I know a number of clients who are purchasing items right now, and because there's not much travel happening and things have kind of shifted, some people's financial situations have set up that they're not doing the travel as much. They're not spending their money on the entertainment, and they're actually spending more time with their collections
Mm.
and getting a sense of what are some of the things that are missing. How am I changing the shape of my collections? I have one client who really loves doing Venn diagrams of their collection and the various things that are connecting. And sometimes they'll send me photographs of like where they're at with it, and it's expanding and changing in different ways, and things are moving around. So I think it's a period where people are certainly, I don't know if this is the case with club members, but it certainly seems as though collectors are able to sit down and have some time with their collections and really think about them and spend that important time with the items, because there's definitely an energy that and an enthusiasm that comes from the items in the collection, I would say.
Right. So there's a number of questions about how people are kind of organizing and cataloging their collections that you've mentioned a little bit, and you gave a couple of examples.
Yeah.
But maybe you can give a little bit more, expound a little bit more upon what's the right kind of tools. Do you recommend certain, like Excel? I think you said for the sweet spot of X number of items, you might want to just be Excel. But if it's more than this, there's this online cataloging system. Cataloging, I get a lot of questions, and we're actually going to be doing a virtual community meeting on cataloging. Right. How do you organize and catalog your collection? And people can come and share and ask questions, but we can kind of get a jump start on that if you want to share some of your thoughts.
Sure. Yeah. I think with regards to the softwares, there are a ton of different softwares. There's a lot of choice there. So I won't advocate for one over the other. Really, they're all they've got their own little quirks and things. I think one thing that I have been noticing is that a number of my clients are liking to have some of the ones that you can actually download onto your computer. Quite a few of them are cloud-based, and there's been concern about how secure that the data is, or in terms of storage if there's an outage. are you able to access that data? Because a lot of those companies are renting their storage from third-party providers.
Server farm, yeah.
So there's something there about just the effort and so making sure you do backup of that stuff. But just to say that the software stuff is useful and helpful when you have, if you're interested in collecting, if you're collecting quite a bit of things or quite a bit of one item, and you're interested in duplicates, you're interested in the additions. Say if you're collecting prints, for instance, having photographs and being able to run a program that allows you to access them and zoom in and see the detail, that's really helpful for that sort of thing. But what I would say is with smaller collections where you can more or less recall where things are and you know what they look at or what they look like, Excel really helps for getting a sense of the chronology of the items, so the publishing histories, things of that nature, and you can kind of jump around and play around with that idea of the appearance of items, but also the intake of the history of when you were buying those items.
Oh yeah.
And then one of the things I think one of the really useful things about cataloging is to just keep on, what your intake levels were, what you purchased an item for, what are some of the appearances of it in auction, and how that might change or affect the valuation of your items. So basically almost trying to keep an ongoing evaluation or evaluation of your collection itself. That's really where it is helpful. And yeah, so I mean, in terms of the nuts and bolts of of cataloging itself, that's it's very much like what you'd see through a dealer's catalog, and as much kind of background description of the context around the creation of that book or that print. If you think about like a photograph that was printed by the photographer or printed later on by someone else, maybe a family member or maybe someone who's within an agency, how does that change the story of that object? And then there's a kind of secondary exploration that you can do in your catalogs of telling the story of when you got that item or how you think it connects to other items within the collection.
Right.
So, I say, like, there's the nuts and bolts part that you guys can have a conversation about through your club. But I think that something that's really interesting to do is create it almost like a journal or like a log as to how it connects with your process of collecting itself.
Wow, it's a lot. It can be a lot. For some of the people who asked this question in the chat, there's a reference to Readerware 4 as a software for super book cataloging, if no one has seen that. A number of people have also mentioned Excel as something they're using. And I think those are the ones that are mostly called out in the chat.
I like Excel because Excel is just so flexible. I mean, you can put as many different fields, like different columns in it, and it's not flashy, but it is what you make of it. If you want to print it out, it has a very sort of straightforward layout when it prints out, and that's one that I find my clients using just because you're comfortable with it. I like to be able to introduce softwares that are accessible to the users, and I'm finding that a lot of these softwares are kind of finicky in one way or another. So I'm still searching. I'll let you know if I find the ultimate group, but it's taking time.
There's a really good last question about the cataloging topic here, and basically it says, can you address the benefits of current cataloging after a collection is deaccessioned? The better the cataloging, the more value maybe the collection is captured that transcends the objects and relates more to their relationship to one another, kind of what you're saying. And any thoughts on that? Cataloging after a collection is deaccessioned.
Trying to find the collection, or where is this question?
That's in the Q&A.
Okay.
It's second to the bottom in the Q&A.
Good question. I just wanted to see all the elements of it.
Yeah.
Can you address benefits of current cataloging?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I do have a couple of clients that have kind of almost in a forensic way gone back around on collections that they'd formed through their purchase records. Um, and this is I'm just trying to look at the background.
With apologies for the wordiness at the end.
Yeah,
It's a long question, but it's a
there's just
good one.
there's so many questions in that are really good
Yeah,
questions.
yeah.
You
Maybe
know,
just pick one element of it.
yeah, I mean, I think with it helps to within these contexts that I'm thinking of clients that have done that kind of, I'm just going to call it, for lack of a better word, kind of forensic cataloging of their collections to
Mhm.
look at where they're currently going in their collecting. Um, it has helped. It's helped them to get a sense of, just how that linked to where they're going in the future, and also to communicate to. I know in these both cases they have families that are starting to become interested in their history of their collecting, because both clients actually collected before they were in relationships with their partners and had children. So there's this talk of when I started collecting, and oh, you collected this and you were interested in that, and you were living in this area, and that kind of opens up this conversation of collecting as a vehicle for exploring the world, which is kind of another thing that I think about.
Yeah.
In terms of current cataloging, with the anticipation of deaccession, let's say these are items that you still have in your collection. Um, that's useful, not only for thinking about, let's say you have uh, a, a, a portion of your collection that you're not really building anymore, or your enthusiasm somewhat changed about it, or that you're going into a new direction and you're kind of leaving that one to the wayside, to think about when might be the right time to offer it at market, and maybe use that as a bouncing off point for the new direction that you're collecting in.
Mhm.
And furthermore, if you're doing, let's say there's an instance where you're in the process or interested in um, uh, donating or selling your collection to an institution, smaller part of your collection, um, it is so helpful to provide as much information as you can from the outset when dealing with institutions about your collections, so that you can start to have contact with people in the institution, and then you can start to communicate what are some of your interests as to placing this collection within an institution. So doing that as soon as you can with a consistency is really useful, because I like to think of it as kind of first impressions. There are people working in these in institutions who have a myriad of different things to do during the day, and if you can provide them with the most amount of information from the outset to start that conversation, which is
Right.
in reality years in the making. It takes
Mhm.
quite some time to have to continue that conversation. And if you have a good sense of your collection, you can start to look around to different institutions who are interested in maybe the same topics, and you can start to search their collection to see how your collection may fill out that collecting interest that they have. So
Mhm.
that's an institutional example of how it's useful to have current cataloging. I
Yeah.
hope that's kind of dealt with that
Yeah,
question.
there is a specific question about finding, how do you go about finding someplace to give your collection to? And I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. But first, there's also the question, can you go back 2 slides to that great slide with the 5 points on it? Because I think a couple people wanted to write that down.
Oh, okay, there it is.
There it is, 1 slide back. So there's, for those of you who wanted those 5 points, look at those, write them down, and we'll continue with a couple more questions. We're not quite at the top of the hour yet. So
Okay.
we'll go back to that question about how do you go about finding someplace to give your collection to?
Yeah. It well, it starts with starts with cataloging the collection, I would say. From stepping back, having a look, so much of collecting is about one's, when you are collecting, you're forming an identity. It's difficult in some cases to have a critical distance about your collecting. And so cataloging really helps to, and whether you're doing it or whether you have an advisor or someone help you do it, and sometimes someone helping you do it, it actually allows you to step even further back from it to be more
Right.
analytical about it. You can start to identify what is the shape of your collection and what are the major themes and how are those themes being expressed through the collecting that you're doing. And from there, you can start to take the time to just look around, start to think about, okay, is my collection a more general theme? Is it, where am I? Where am I situated physically?
Mm.
Say in California. Um, is my item, are my collections to do with, say, early efforts to make books in California? So that
Right.
changes the scope and the scale and where you might start to look at institutions.
Right. If it's a hyper specific theme or topic, or object or idea, then you'll need to find somebody that's interested in that hyper specific thing.
That's right. So if if it's something that's a bit more general, or say connects to, let's say you're collecting, things to do with like punk ephemera from LA, but like something that's very, very locally specific, but might tie into a larger discussion, that might be a place to speak to, the representatives of that institution. So what you do is you get a sense of kind of where you're at, where you're situated, what's the topic that you're working on. Is it a more global topic or is it a specific topic? And then start to look at some of those institutions that resonate with that, kind of connect with that theme, and have a look at some of what they're openly saying they're looking for. A lot of special collections and institutions will provide that. And you can sort of have a look at what are some of the directions and focuses that they're interested in. And then from there, kind of create a written description, a kind of story of the collection that you have, what it's made of, maybe some of the highlights of it, the scale of it, the size of it. This is all stuff you can start to get a sense of through your cataloging, and then you start to work from there. I think that's that's as far as it goes. Then the details of whether they're interested or not, that sort of changes the conversation. But it's a good way of starting, as opposed to just contacting an institution saying you're interested in this thing, you have some books about it, or
Right.
you can get further down the road.
Yeah, exactly.
With a lot of your own work.
Yeah,
So.
make their job easier, right? In identifying and knowing that they want what it is they want them to have.
And I think that also, with the clients that I work with, doing that process also helps you to connect with the journey of your collecting. Oftentimes what will happen is someone will present their collection to an institution without having taken the time to really take stock of their items, and through a possible lack of interest of the institution, or maybe they're not collecting that anymore, that rejection can have a kind of massive effect on the person who's collecting, because they're actually processing a bunch of different things at once. They're dealing with the journey of their collecting, and so that maybe that lack of interest in that institution, or that lack of focus that they have on that theme, can be seen as a kind of larger affront. And I think it's important to take the time, equivalent amount of time almost, to the time you've taken in building the collection. Yeah.
So there's a great question here from a member in the Q&A, but it was also sent to me in a personal chat, because everybody wants to know these great fun stories. It says early collectors make lots of mistakes. What are the most kind of serious mistakes that you've encountered in evaluating collections? And is there any kind of advice that you want to give in forming a collection? That's maybe more for the newbies.
Yeah. I'd start with maybe the starting out question, like the young collectors or early collectors. I'll address that question and think about maybe an example of a kind of not such a great story.
Not a great situation. Yeah.
So I'm a couple of clients of mine who are kind of middle career clients have, they've introduced me to some people in their who are family and friends who are starting out, who are younger collectors in their late 20s and in their 30s. The thing that's immediately apparent is that, and this is I think advice that I would give to people starting out, is to maybe look off the beaten trail. Think about some of the stuff that inspires you and interests you, that maybe isn't already collected, that doesn't already have a predetermined market, and see if there's a way in through that. It's hard to do, but it can be quite interesting. I mean, there are some collectors I know who are in their 30s who are collecting modern firsts right now. They're interested in Thomas Pynchon and things like that. And if you have the resources, that's great. And I think it is really interesting. It's but it is very much that book as object kind of thing. These aren't reader copies, and they sit in that kind of coveted space. But then there are other people that I know who are sort of collecting flyers of the kind of spiritual music scene of the West Coast, and like yoga retreats and self-help books along the West Coast. And this is stuff that's like readily available. The graphic design is amazing. I mean, there's just so much within it that and it seems boundless. Like, I mean, I keep checking in with this person and they'll send me messages of like, check out this thing I just found. And it's a history, it's a book where the the publishing house is in the interior of British Columbia, and it connects to a retreat that was happening in the 60s. And so there's there's this kind of digging that happens there. So I would say maybe look obliquely, like look off and ask those questions of like, wouldn't that be weird if there was a collection of that, or I wonder if there are those items, and try and answer those. Start with a question would be maybe what I say to younger people. One of the things I am noticing is that because digital natives are their researching capabilities online, or their ability to source the very particular one thing is so honed that I'm finding these collections are not like collections that were, say, built in the time immediately after World War II. So some of the older collectors that I'm dealing with who were perhaps buying things sight unseen, or buying from catalogs without images, or maybe didn't have relationships with the dealers, or the dealers were overseas and there were things that didn't match the descriptions of what they bought, and they didn't return them, or they just kind of amassed them in that particular way. So that's something that I'm noticing immediately. And I that's part of that is the research, but another element of that is just also my necessity of the space that they're living in. The older collectors being ones that have the security of a house, whereas some of these younger collectors are still renting, and that kind of affects the way that they're collecting.
Yeah.
But when people talk about how people aren't collecting right now, that's not what I'm just not seeing that. People who who I'm not even advising, but are younger people, I'm seeing evidence of people collecting. They're just doing it in a very very, very targeted way. Maybe one thing that I would think of, one just cautionary tale that I think of at the top of my head is someone that was collecting, particularly, they were sort of occult books on the very high end, and this gentleman was collecting them with the idea that he would ultimately profit off of them. There was a kind of, he was interested in this stuff from his own kind of personal explorations of occult mysticism, but that he was no longer kind of interested in that, and he started to believe that, oh, this is kind of a bit of a nest egg, something that I can profit off of, and kept it for longer than I think he should have. He'd lost interest in it, and it was kind of like he was holding it around, and he'd moved to various places. And so it had become a bit of a burden carrying that collection around. And ultimately, when he offered it, it was really kind of a rarefied group of collectors who were interested in that material. And almost all of them had already had those titles. And in many cases, the condition of the titles that they'd purchased were of a higher quality. And these were, the collectors within that group were very particular about the condition of them. And so he was sort of left with this collection. I think I can't remember what he ultimately did with it. I think he did ultimately sell it to a dealer at a lesser expectation. But what I would say that why this is a cautionary tale is that in speaking with this person over time, the practice, like the journey of the collecting, the way it was connected to the identity, was ultimately turned around and like looked at with resentment.
Right.
And that's heartbreaking. I mean, that's tough for the person who's collecting, but it's also difficult for these items that are passing through the orbit of this collector and are traveling out in the world again. You know, I really do think that it can have an effect on that.
Yeah.
So I think kind of getting a sense of being honest with the process by which you collect is something that's important.
So I want you to go back to your last slide because hopefully everybody got the 5 points from here. We'll go back to your closing slide because I'm going to wrap up here with asking kind of a bigger question for you.
Okay.
And the question is really, could you speak a little bit more about what you mean when you say working with a client, right? Because I hear when I hear you talk, I hear that you're like an analyst and a counselor and sometimes a therapist and right, and sometimes a facilitator to help people kind of build their collections and understand their collections and maybe even understand themselves better. So, you know, are you actually finding items for people's collections? Are you advising them? You know, what exactly, and I'm guessing maybe your relationship with each collector is a little different, but maybe you could talk a little bit about some of the actual things that you do.
Yeah. So, I mean, the best way to think of it is through the different stages of collecting. So, you know, early collecting, someone who's just setting out, who's maybe just started to identify as being a collector in a particular realm. That's a smaller percentage of the people I work with, but and they're new to collecting in general. So let's and so with a client of that nature, I'll work with them through talking about what they're interested in, where they may find sources for those items, and discussions of, you know, bibliographies. And you know, if it's I work with people who collect photographs and prints as well. That was also something that, you know, that's something that I specialize in. So I'll talk with them with the various source texts and important books in a given you know, in a given general field, about, you know, identifying what, you know, what the difference between lithos and things like that, and looking for particular marks or quality marks for items. So just to kind of become a bit more of a connoisseur of what you're collecting, if that's what you're, you know, if you're interested in quality, if you're interested in condition for your collecting. So I'll talk with them about that, and talk with them about you know, the timelines and thoughts about, you know, how much would be required to create that collection in a day, kind of thing, or think about timelines of how long do you want to develop this collection for? Like, is this a long-term thing where you just want to have it guided through serendipity, but understand that relationship?
You were frozen there for a second on my screen. It could be mine.
Could you still hear me, or am I still there? Hello? How about now? Are we in there?
Yeah, it's me. I think it's my internet connection. I think you're fine. I think people can hear you okay.
Great.
Yeah, they can hear you.
Then on to, you know, on to middle career collectors. You know, I'll help with cataloging those collections, stabilizing them in the physical spaces where they are, discussing conditions, you know, possible best possible storage places, things like that. And then discussions about, you know, through the cataloging process, that's really, it's kind of like a nucleus that really helps as a crossroads for people who are collecting to understand where they're at, and where they want to go. So it's a really like kind of like an adjustment, a getting sense of, you know, what are the directions, what are some of the focuses, what are some of the interests now with their collecting, you know, what are they learning now that they didn't before, and from that start to make those decisions to kind of hone down the collection. Because leading to the latter stage clients that I work with, helping people with the process of deaccessioning their collections of, you know, be it breaking up that collection and selling it to various channels. So be it auction houses, through dealers, or gifting it to family and friends, or through an institution. That's a process that takes some time to be able to do it right. And you're talking about that feeling of the kind of emotional element of it.
Mm.
That's, there is very much a sense of making sure there's closure to it, because there's absolutely a connection of that and one's emotional journey as well. There is, collecting is an intellectual process, but it's also one of self-discovery at the same time.
Yeah.
I think that's the reason it perpetuates itself. And it is a practice. It is a culture there is a culture of collecting in that sense, because you practice it. And so with clients of that nature, I do similar stuff to what I do with mid-stage collectors, of cataloging the items, but also starting to develop those relationships with institutions, starting to talk about which dealers they can contact about deaccessioning if they don't already have relationships with those dealers. And then also, if it's an interest in family and gifting, most times I've been dealing with them through the middle stage into that transition to late stage, and they're starting to already talk about those stories and think about relaying it on to others. I think it's something that happens quite a bit. I hear this often with collectors who are talking about how they don't want to bore people about their collections. But this simply, I think there's so many different ways that you can access one's collection. And when you are the collector of it, in some ways you stay in an avenue. You start to know the well-worn path into the world that you've made through your collecting.
Mm-hmm.
And there are tons of different ways to get into it. Most of the time when you feel like you're kind of boring people, it's more so just a reflection of the fact you've heard the story, you've told this story before, but really it's something that always has potential for people to be interested in. And it is a really interesting legacy to pass on. So even if you do decide to sell the collection in one way or another, to be able to provide that story to those around you, I think it's meaningful and worthwhile taking the effort to do that. So yeah. I work in those various ways. It always starts with a meeting with the collector to sort of discuss where they're at, what are some of their outcomes, and then where they want to go. But that really does, some of the concrete definite things that happen are helping with the cataloging, and then through helping with the cataloging is giving an analytic approach to the holdings of those collections.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, you have been not at all boring tonight. There's some great comments in the chat about how terrific this presentation was, and how people, this was fantastic. Another one just popped up. I agree. This was really fantastic, eye-opening to me, and I think to many of our folks who've attended. We'll be sending out in the email tomorrow this information, how to contact Spencer if you're interested, and links to his website and his email and all of that kind of stuff to everyone who attended tomorrow. So we're about 15 minutes past the hour here, because we were that engrossed in this conversation. Lots of, again, great chat coming in. Congratulations, wonderful presentation. So I just want to thank you, Spencer. This was really, really terrific. I really enjoyed it, and I think everyone else did as well. So thank you. And I want to thank all of our attendees this evening for coming to this Book Club of California program. I hope you'll join us for our next online program, which is Pasadena printmaker Francis Gerhardt Celebrates California on Monday, January 25th. So not a week from tonight, 2 weeks from tonight will be our next live online Zoom webinar, January 25th. From 5 to 6:15 p.m. here on Zoom. This is going to be another live presentation by author Susan Futterman, who wrote a book about Francis Gerhardt, and she'll be sharing some great artwork from that Pasadena printmaker with us. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs, or using the link in the weekly programs email that you may be receiving from the Book Club of California. So again, thank you, Spencer. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. Everyone have a wonderful night. Be well and take care. Bye now.
Thank you.